Some of the most pioneering musicians like Eric Clapton, Jimi Hendrix, Lennon and McCartney are all largely self-taught in what they do. And while there's both pros and cons of being self-taught in something and being professionally trained in something, not just in music and learning to play an instrument, but also in lots of other professions as well, what I want to focus on in this video is trying to understand exactly what it is that gives people who are self-taught in something a unique edge. I'll be covering some musical and non-musical examples of this, and if you watch till the end, I'll also try and show you how you can kind of harness this more self-teaching type approach, even if, like me, you're kind of generally a bit more trained in what you do. It doesn't have to be one approach or the other, and it may just make you a little bit more unique and creative in how you do things in the future. Sometimes knowing the right way to do something can be a disadvantage. When you do something the way that you've been taught using a method that is widely accepted and proven to work, you get results that are very predictable, efficient maybe, but very obvious and quite rigid. Now, if you're brave enough to take it upon yourself to see if there are any other ways of doing these things, then yeah, it's a messier process. People are probably going to look at you a bit funny, but the results are often so much more unique and interesting and creatively valuable. It's a much more open way of thinking. I'll start with some non-musical examples of this because I think those highlight the benefits of this thought process most clearly. So in the 1700s, there's this big worldwide problem of not being able to navigate a ship accurately enough when at sea. So sailors never really quite knew where they were. The methods used for navigation just weren't accurate enough. So that leads to lots of ships lost at sea. You can't make accurate maps, shipwrecks, dead people, not good. The conventional way of solving the problem at the time was to use what's called lunar navigation, which is where you take measurements of like the moon, the stars, the horizon, and you make calculations based on that to find your location. And they were trying to think of better and better calculations that you could make so that you could more accurately navigate. Now in comes a carpenter from Wakefield here in the UK, John Harrison, and he isn't an expert in lunar navigation or anything, but he does happen to be a keen self-taught clockmaker. Just has a fascination with clocks and how clocks work, I think. And he realizes that the problem can be solved in a different way. He realizes if you have a super accurate clock that can keep its accuracy while out at sea, then the problem can be solved in a different way. So he goes out to make a series of these super accurate clocks designed for navigation. And it actually solves the problem far better than any of the leading lunar navigation methods. And it really changes the world, it saves a lot of lives, and over time it means that explorers can go out and map out the rest of the world with accuracy. Now think about this, if John Harrison had been highly trained in the right way of doing things, in this case lunar navigation, then he wouldn't have been successful. And similarly, if he'd have been professionally trained as a clockmaker, trained to make clocks like everyone else, then it's unlikely that he would have had the thought process and creativity needed to invent a whole new way of building clocks. It was because he was untrained and self-taught that gave him the edge. And I suspect made him very good at that more open thought process that let him figure things out for himself. And that is one of the most valuable things about being self-taught in something, having a thought process that lets you figure things out for yourself. I'll move on to a slightly more music-related example now. So Jeff "Skunk" Baxter, who played guitar in the Doobie Brothers and Steely Dan, somehow, whilst researching music technology, stumbled upon some information on the technology of weapon defense systems, and it interested him. And he then became a self-taught expert in missile defense systems, and off his own back wrote a public essay on some of his ideas about how to improve missile defense systems in the US. Now, as a result of that, he was hired by the Pentagon, who found his ideas pretty interesting, and they hired him as a consultant and advisor to the Pentagon's Missile Defense Agency. And when his boss was asked what it was that Jeff "Skunk" Baxter brought to the table that his other workers didn't, his boss said it was an out-of-the-box style way of thinking, and that he came at problems from a totally different angle that his more conventionally educated workers simply would never have thought of. So even in something as kind of scientific as missile defense, there's a good indication that there's high value in having a more self-taught approach to learning, and that it can give a very valuable, unique perspective. Okay, for this next example, I want to look at what this kind of self-taught open thought process, where you're trying to figure things out for yourself, what it actually looks like when you're on an instrument. So let's take a standard guitar technique like string bends. That is the conventional way of how to do a string bend. Bend the string up with your fretting hand and push the other strings out of the way at the same time. So now for the important bit, ask yourself, are there any other ways that you can bend a string? And can you use any of those techniques to create something more interesting and unique and creatively valuable? So I'll go through a few different ways you can bend a string. They're all pretty weird at first, but we're looking at something we could later develop. It doesn't have to have value right away. So for example, you could bend the string using the picking hand behind the fretting hand like this. You could bend the string behind the nut. You could use the tuner. You could flex the neck, which is a weird one. So there's a few different ideas there. Let's go with the first one, using the right hand to bend the string just behind the fretting hand. So it just seems strange and inefficient at first, but stay with it. We're looking at something that we can later develop into something, more interesting and creatively valuable. So one thing that you can get from doing this bend behind the fretting hand is that you can bend a lot higher, a lot more easily. So like this. Kind of has the sound of a whammy pedal or a whammy bar or something. Another thing you can do is, because it frees up the tension in the fretting hand, you can now use hammer-ons and pull-offs at the same time as doing a string bend. So you can do things like that, and that's how Randy Rhoads would sometimes do his string bends. And while he's certainly not a completely self-taught player by any means, something tells me he didn't get that idea for doing string bends from reading a book about how to bend strings on an electric guitar. So how do you train yourself to be untrained? I think the answer is definitely not to simply just stop training or stop practicing. That's just not going to work. What's probably a better idea is if you try and practice in a way that encourages you to develop a thought process so that you can discover things for yourself. It's almost like trying to think a bit more like a beginner, being more childlike and playful in your practice, maybe being a bit less structured, asking lots of questions, being less afraid of failure as well. You saw how daft some of those string bends looked like. That's, I think, kind of all part of it. There are tons of things I could talk about here, but I think one of the easiest things you can do to get it more into this way of thinking is to just simply ask yourself questions. Ask yourself questions that interest you and find the answers to them all on your own. Set time aside for it, just like you would any other practice. Make notes of your discoveries. Develop the ideas. Take them seriously. And don't be discouraged or worried if this way of thinking doesn't come naturally to you right away. I've heard a lot of people describe creative thinking as kind of like a muscle, that it needs a bit of training before it becomes easier to do. I hope you found this video useful. If you did, think about liking the video and maybe subscribing to the channel. And thanks for watching.